Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. The win that Junior Fa has ground out against the durable late stand-in opponent Craig Lewis, it's helped add some perspective in my view to where the now 14-0 prospect is at in his development. He's a talented prospect, but very much a work in progress. He's not a finished product. I mean, after seeing a dominant performance in November against Fred Latham, there was always going to be high expectations from some that a repeat performance was going to happen in his next ring appearance. But instead, so what we saw was a decent performance that was workmanlike in appearance, and perhaps a little disappointing in stretches. But overall, it is a good win, and more importantly, I think it will help to temper expectation this year. Those were rising. So I see the rest of this year as being one in which he needs to keep slowly building and look to 2019 for contender status. More on that in a moment. So I'll get to the fight first. So Fa, he picked up where he left off against Latham. He was pressing the action from the outset. He was coming in, he was aggressive, and almost he was reckless at times, jumping in, and he was wide open to the counter. And if you saw the fight, you may have noticed that even early on, Lewis was having some success. Not a whole lot, but he was having some success firing back when Fa was charging in. But it was obvious that from the first round or two, Fa, he was simply the better boxer. He was a cut above where Lewis is currently at. Fa, he was doing well enough in those early rounds to win them in my view, simply because Lewis, he was generally tracking back and not really throwing enough at Fa. Fa was the aggressor, he was the one landing most of the work, and Lewis, he was really looking to sort of cover up, survive, get out of the way. He was throwing some back, but it just wasn't enough to win any of those early rounds. At times, in particular in the fourth, Fa, he landed some really heavy shots that visibly hurt and slowed Lewis. But for me, what was missing was the punch variation, the combinations. It was largely a demonstration of the 1-2, 1-2, and that was for most of the night. And disappointingly, the jab, it seemed to fall away from early on. It just kind of evaporated. And if you follow my Twitter, boxing_squared, you would have seen me commenting on some of the stuff during the fight. I gave Lewis the fifth round. He was more the aggressor in that round as a clearly tiring Fa looked to conserve a bit of energy. And it was obvious in those final four rounds that both guys very tired. And it's sort of hard to know with the altitude of South Dakota how much of a hand that had in both guys being tired. I mean, Lewis, he was a bit more ragged from earlier on, but Fa, he was definitely sucking in the big ones as well. In terms of the rest of the fight, I gave Lewis the 7th and Fa the 8th. So on my card, I had the score 78-74 to Fa. The judges, they had it 79-73, 78-74 to Fa. But quizzically, one judge had it a draw, which I couldn't fathom when the cards were read out. I just couldn't see how Craig Lewis got 4 rounds. He simply, beyond a couple of rounds, wasn't doing much. He was either covering up, going backwards, and, landing the odd counter, but he just simply wasn't doing enough. So I really do question that 76-all scorecard. Junior Fa, so after the fight, he posted on Facebook, came away with a win. An ugly win, but a win regardless. Can't wait to get home to see my wife and 2 children. We'll go back to the drawing board for improvement. Ain't nothing changed. The goal is still the same. And I guess an ugly win, it's a good way to sum it up. It certainly wasn't the polished effort that some of us were hoping for, but it's still a win, and winning is winning. And Fa, he will definitely be better for the rounds, for toughing it out, and he'll learn from it. And I'm sure he's going to come away with some learning experiences, because one thing I think Fa should have done in the fight was resort to a bit of a plan B when his aggressive leap in with the 1-2 approach didn't pay dividends. Sure, it was working nicely in the first couple of rounds, but he just kept at it, and it didn't really seem to deviate from it. It would have been good to see Fa build into some combinations when he was landing, because when he was hitting Lewis and hurting him, he was there to be hit some more, but Fa would either resort back to the 1-2 or he'd sort of, clinch. And just a bit more punch variation in general through the fight, it could have actually helped Fa break Lewis down. After a while, Lewis, he was making adjustments. He was seeing, well, the 1-2's coming again, the 1-2's coming again, and he was dipping out of the way, dipping down to the right to avoid the incoming right. But Junior Fa, he was a bit slow to recognise that the adjustment had been made, and he wasn't adjusting accordingly. And the commentators, they were making much of the jab going missing, and understandably so. Fa, he's got a decent jab, but it did go missing. In terms of defence, Fa, at times, he was very wide open, and he did eat some good shots from Lewis. But perhaps some of that comes down to he was tasting the power. He sort of summed it up and decided, actually, I'm willing to take a few shots to land a few shots. Because at no time in the fight was Fa really covering up, or even forced to cover up. There were a few decent blows landed, but Fa, in general, seemed to take them pretty well. In respect of Junior Fa's gas tank, this one might be a bit of a wait and see for judgment. The fight, it was at altitude, and Lewis, he was also certainly huffing in the big ones. And that was a round or two before Fa. He was looking a bit ragged from about the third round on. I do think I'd need to see a bit more before making a judgment about, does Junior Fa have a stamina issue? I think some of the altitude probably did play a part, but we'll have to wait and see on this one. I've seen a few comments suggesting that Fa's power was potentially down from previous fights, and perhaps his recent and rapid weight loss was a cause for this. I mean, that's certainly a possibility, but again, I think I would need to see more to be sure either way. I think the other thing to consider in all this is actually Craig Lewis. He was a very durable opponent. He had a number of clean right hands, and he didn't go down. And he was hurt at times, sure, but he managed to recover. He was taking Junior Fa's best. So some credit it must go to Lewis, and because he was definitely better than advertised. I didn't think much of his record, which was a bit thin, in appearance, and it sort of belied the fact that actually he's a pretty tough and durable guy, and he certainly kept coming all night. But what was clear, Fa has more work to do. He's a work in progress, and I do hope to see him continue working through the levels of mid to higher level journeyman in 2018. As I've said before, Fa is still on the way up. He's going to have the occasional off night and off the boil performance like he did against Lewis. He's still learning. And I think the real benefit from this fight, aside from going 8 rounds versus a durable opponent, is it could serve to bring expectations down a bit, back down to earth. The hype it had actually built markedly since the Latham performance. He even made ESPN's best top 20 prospects in all of boxing. So that sort of stuff and the way fans were starting to talk about him, it maybe been starting to get a little out of control. I mean, a number of fans have even been saying, he should be taking on top-level contenders. Fight a Daniel Dubois, fight a Dillian Whyte. I don't think he's ready for that. He shouldn't be rushed into that sort of thing either. I think he will be ready eventually, but that's more next year, potentially. But we need to see how he shakes down this year against decent level opposition that's going to test him. So working through that mid-level, higher level journeyman sort of type of opponent. I think he can get to contender level, but he can't be rushed there at the same time. So the original opponent for March 9th, Joey Daweko, I think he would still be a good opponent for Fa to test himself against if they can make that fight again. And Fa, he actually may be better prepared a second time around if he does tweak a few more things and continues to bed in other things that he has been doing and working on. And I know it would be easy for some to say it was a bad or disappointing performance, but I think in the context of Junior Fa's career, it was another good learning experience he will benefit from. He's not going to knock over every guy, not going to knock everyone out. And more likely, the higher he goes, the deeper he will be pushed into fights and he'll be tested more. That just is something that happens. The higher you go, the bigger the test, the bigger the risks. And sometimes you've got to put that aggressive strategy to one side depending on who the opponent is. Sometimes you do have to rely on boxing skill, boxing moxie, and you've got to grit and grind your way through these things. And we saw that with the Craig Lewis win. It wasn't pretty, but he got it done. Job done, and on to the next one. What do you make of it all? What did you think of the performance versus Craig Lewis? Has it altered your perceptions of Junior Fa? How far do you see him going? And do you, like me, agree that actually this year is more of a building year, and 2019 and beyond, that's really when we could see the best of Junior Fa? Drop a comment loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.